Good evening. The meeting of the Utilities Committee. It is Thursday, May 17th, and it's 6:20 in the evening. To my right is Mr. Lutz, and I'm Mr. Twilliger, Chairperson of the Utilities Commission, or Committee. This evening, we are here to hear information dealing with a recommendation regarding rights of way and communication systems within Troy. Mr. Titterington.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. You have a report from us that talks about the wireless facilities legislation. This would be section 921, as well as 903.27. 921 would be a new chapter. 903 would be amended to include .27. This is with regards to recently passed legislation at the state level known as HB 478. At the end of 2016, the state passed some legislation that would, in municipalities' opinion, violate home rule provisions as well as some other constitutional provisions of the Ohio Constitution. As a result, 90-plus communities filed a class action lawsuit. It was the HB, the prior version was ruled unconstitutional. The state legislature asked us to, us being the municipalities, to come together with members of the legislature as well as the telecommunications industry and try to work out a compromise bill. What this involves is what's commonly known as small cell technology. Right now, the wireless technology out there is commonly known as LTE. You had 4G, now you have LTE, and what has been recently improved upon is what's now known as 5G technology. When you get into the 5G technology, the equipment is much smaller. It is a different type of deployment strategy whereby you put the antennas, the boxes, the equipment closer to the ground and closer to the density of population, and by doing that, you are able to, in layman's terms, broaden the spectrum, increase and improve frequency, saturation, if you will, as well as speeds and access improve also. That's the extent of what I know, so please don't ask me any more technical questions. Or you can ask, but don't expect any answers. I may have to make something up, but I won't. I can always get you those answers. The original bill that failed in the courts would have pretty much stripped communities of their rights to regulate our right-of-ways with regards to the small cell providers. It was very broad, it was very intrusive, had very few standards for how, when, where, what, all the big W's and the how this technology would be installed. The bill that was passed and signed by Governor Kasich approximately 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, is significantly better. It's something that we feel confident allows us to control our right-of-ways. It still will be slightly intrusive. People are still going to see some equipment. They're going to see some new poles where they can't co-locate on existing poles, for example. And there is the necessity that there may be some oversized poles every once in a while every so often, just because of the way the technology needs to be deployed. However, the law allows communities to incorporate regulations that dictate all of those areas that I just mentioned. What it looks like, where it's located, how they can apply, who can apply, and the timelines, the fees, et cetera. That's all now regulated at the state level, provided that the municipalities have something in place locally to enact and adopt what the state is allowing us to do. That is what 903 is all about. I'm sorry, 921 is all about. 903 is a modification to our current telecommunications law, but what it does is it allows us to designate certain areas in town, which are probably more areas than you might think, where we don't want that technology, primarily any of the electrical lines, connections between poles, to be above ground. We have several areas in town, and what staff did was they went out with the GPS equipment and drove every street in Troy and looked at where we have overhead electric lines and where we don't. And so I believe in your packet, maybe not in your packet, but we can provide it for you. We do have a map that designates, and these are the orange areas here, that show where we would designate underground only utilities. And these are areas that include our historic downtown, all of the utilities of which are underground. Any relatively new and brand new residential subdivisions where we have street lights, but we require all of the lines to be buried. We have other areas where we may have the street lights and the lines buried, and on all the electric poles are actually between backyards and easements, so they're not in our right of way, and we want to protect the integrity of that right of way and not allow small cell poles to go in. And we have to, by law, designate those areas where we are going to hold the small cell providers or installers to the same standards as we expect everywhere else. It also allows us, and one of the areas that you'll see is Water Street, where right now we do have some lines, primarily Frontier lines, that are overhead, but we are, as we redevelop Water Street, we're already seeing some of those lines go underground. Because we are committing that as new developments occur, we will require all the lines to go down accordingly. If a small cell provider comes in with an application on Water Street, we can say that's designated as an underground area. But again, to do that, we have to codify that locally, and that's why that's the other part of this legislation. We have 90 days to from the date of when he signed to have everything effective, or 90 days prior in some cases to when the first application comes forward. We've had inquiries, so we know we'll probably get one or two applications almost immediately. So time is of the essence. And so, and I will say that Mr. Kerber, Law Director, has looked at this and has approved this. The staff, of course, has been involved in this. And the legislation that Grant improved upon and maybe Troyized, if you will, localized it to our language and our style. It was, it's common language that's been best practice that we got from other larger cities, including Kettering and Cincinnati. So we're not starting from scratch. Everybody is adopting similar legislation from the model legislation that was initially drafted. And so we are, again, asking for emergency legislation because of the urgency of getting this in effect as quickly as possible. I think that's all.
Mr. Lutz.
Probably because I'm a glutton for punishment, I read the final analysis of substitute House Bill 478 from the Legislative Service Commission, and there were a lot of questions that I had, and I don't know if we can answer them here, but can we require these companies to co-locate on infrastructure that's already in the right-of-way rather than having them build their own poles?
Yes, as long as they have to show up, they have to demonstrate that co-locating will not allow them to deploy the way they need to deploy. Otherwise, they are required to co-locate.
Okay.
So in other words, if they need equipment every 300 feet and our pole is 350 feet away, they can argue that, well, I can't go pole to pole here because the signal, the technology doesn't get that far, so I need to have a pole somewhere in between.
Okay.
Where that's the case, though, there's also regulations in the legislation that say, okay, you can put a pole in the interim, but you have to make sure that it's the right height, it's the right look, it's not too close to a pole, so it's just right next to each other. So it really encourages us and the telecom providers to discuss how to do it and sit down and kind of negotiate these things. And nothing in this legislation precludes us, if it's in our best interest, to vary from these regulations if there are things that we can get. I mean, if somebody wants to, if somebody, for example, wants to come in and they need something, maybe a little bigger pole, or they can't co-locate because of size or wind restrictions, we can sit down with them and talk about, well, if you want to do this, why don't you replace this pole with something better, something different, something that looks nicer. So it gives us that flexibility as well.
Can we require the telecommunication companies to co-locate on poles as well? I mean, if Company A has a pole, can we require Company B to be on that pole as well?
We can. They do have to work together, of course. They do have to come up with some cross agreements. DP&L owns a lot of poles. Miami Valley Lighting, and so that they're aware of this legislation and the fact that these folks have to come in and talk to them about it. They'll have to negotiate charges, much like the telephone companies and the internet companies do right now.
Another question I had was, as I read the analysis, it appears that communities can either have each separate location as a separate application, or the company can group them as one with up to 30 locations in one application. Mm-hmm. Have we decided which way we're going to treat these applications?
We really, I'm not aware that we can control how many applications come in. There's a benefit to both us, of course, and the telecom provider to bundle their applications, and we think that's probably what's going to happen, because logically when they come through, they're going to want to do communities or neighborhoods all at once. And when they bundle, we will look at them as a group, and they're under the same timeline, and we're under the same timeline to review, and they have some savings because the less applications they file, the less their fees to us.
While you take a look, the wordage and language that's going to make this legislation up has been tested. We're not inventing a new wheel. There's no potential snares.
One of the communities that was used for the model legislation was from Cincinnati. And they've had some pretty detailed design standards and regulations in place for, I want to say, over a year. They did it in advance of the legislation because they wanted to work out some of their unique details. They worked with the local provider down there in Cincinnati, and so they have some really good language. We also, Kettering is part of our coalition, and they had some ideas as well, and so they took from Cincinnati and they improved upon it. There's some Columbus area communities that also contributed to that, namely Dublin, Upper Arlington, some of those communities. And the law firm that was involved for us in the original litigation, who are telecommunication experts, they also weighed in and helped with the model legislation also as well.
And there is agreement with city staff, and it was called the Miami Valley Communications Council.
Yes, we are adjunct members of the MVCC through our involvement with Northern Miami Valley Local Government Association. Brian Humphreys, who's the executive director of MVCC, and I have both been involved on the conference calls and in the meetings, putting this together and talking with the legislators to get the right legislation through.
Just a couple more quick questions. Will the design guidelines be part of the ordinance that is going to be requested to be adopted?
We are still finalizing the exact guidelines, but the wording is part of the legislation, yes.
Okay. As I read this, and something that kind of stuck out to me, and admittedly it's fairly highly technical, but we cannot deny an application based on the radio frequencies and the power that is emitted from these things. However, is it our best interest to still ask for that information so that if a resident says, what is that thing, we can at least explain, well, this is a small cell type thing. It's at 60 gigahertz, 0.2 watts. I mean,
Yeah.
Would that information be helpful?
As part of our application process, the providers will have to provide what they want to do, what they want to install, where they want to install it, and on what they want to install it. So
Okay.
all of that information will be included in the application. If we don't have the radio frequency and some of that information, the equipment is such that we'd be able to look that up fairly quickly. It's all pretty standard stuff, I guess. There are some filings that I believe they need to do at the state level, because only those that are granted frequencies are would be subject to this. So there are only 4 or 5 providers in Ohio.
Okay.
Now, they do have installers that are third-party installers that are involved in this, but as far as the ones that are controlled and regulated, it's a very small group, and so that information, if we don't have it, will be available at the state level.
Oh, that led me to another question. And I don't know if it applies, but do we have any right-of-way on the interstate? And if we do, would those poles have to be constructed differently, designed differently, given the high level of traffic?
On the interstate is state-controlled right-of-way.
Okay.
Once you get off of the interstate, there is limited right-of-way where it kind of ratchets down from straight state right-of-way to kind of co-owned right-of-way, if you will. So we'd still be subject to ODOT and other state regulations. These laws, though, these regulations would apply to basically any right-of-way, so there's no exemptions there.
Okay. But the state could have more stricter guidelines
They could.
than we could.
They could. Depending on where it's located, I'm not sure how they're going to handle it.
Again, another possibly technical question. If we have these devices and these antennas on utility poles, are we in effect just making a bunch of lightning rods around town? And if we do,
Yeah,
does that?
We've talked we've talked about that. Of course, anything that's on the poles right now are potentially attractors, if you will. That's always a risk, so I'm not going to say that these are lightning rod or lightning proof. But certainly adding antennas to the top of poles could be an issue. But I don't know enough about what those materials are, whether they're metal or they're some kind of coated material. You know, everything's a risk, and no matter how much prevention you put up, Mother Nature is Mother
But
Nature.
does it put us at any extra liability to, if we lost a traffic signal, for example? I mean, are there going to be increased costs with this that maybe we can anticipate?
Okay, so that's a good point, Mr. Lutz, because this, the legislation at the state level that, and what we are adopting exempts city-owned poles from being available to them, unless we want to make them available.
Okay.
So they're not going to have carte blanche to be able to go and stick antennas on top of our mast arms out here that have our stoplights on. We do have some ultimate control. But that's why I brought up the point of we can be flexible, and there may be cases it's in our best interest to allow that with some other modifications, which may include additional lightning prevention.
Okay.
So then, is that it?
I believe so.
So then we are looking for a recommendation to council regarding legislation to regulate the wireless equipment within the city of Troy, Ohio, right-of-ways and establishing underground utilities, and we would like to make this emergency because of the 90 days from May 2nd that it was signed.
Correct.
And you feel?
I have no problem making it an emergency, but I mean, I would really like to see this in final written form. I mean, depending on how it looks, I may ask for a second reading, but I have no problem with the emergency designation.
I feel the same way. Move forward with it.
And would you
Any-
like us to email it? Well, it'll be in your packet.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Tomorrow. So
Okay.
You'll be able to see it.
all right.
Should have asked for any questions from the throng sitting out there in the audience? None? Okay.
There's a long line.
Adjourn.